economy, Egypt devalues its currency as part of controversial financial reforms. Is this what the country needs to turn things around? And at what cost to the people? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dalia Fahmy. A turning point in Egypt's economy. That's how the country's central bank governor describes a decision to devalue its currency. It's one of the requirements laid out by the IMF in order for Cairo to receive a $12 billion loan. The cash-strapped government has also raised fuel prices and plans to cut back on subsidies for consumer goods. The IMF says allowing the Egyptian pound to trade freely will attract foreign investors. But for many people, it's a bitter pill to swallow. Inflation and unemployment are already high, and there are fears that the currency devaluation will cause the price of food and services to soar. The UN says more than a quarter of Egypt's population lives below the poverty line. And frustration about the rising cost of living has prompted calls for demonstrations next week to protest against the government's handling of the economy.
My take, the Egyptian pound collapsed. Our economy is based on the money spent by the tourists, the value of the currency they use in our markets. Our economy is not well structured. It is simply because we have a dictatorship, even when it comes to our economy. The military wants to control everything.
Every time we try to purchase any item, the prices go up and everyone says it is the dollar. Look at the dollar value. We cannot pay our bills.
It's very normal in countries around the world to not have subsidized gas. We need to realize this, and Egypt has to start working and developing.
This happened all of a sudden. I drove into the gas station to fill up my tank as usual, and I swear I never expected this. If I'd prepared for it, it would have been okay. But now it's all of a sudden, and things are going to get more expensive. I bet you anything that from this increase in the price of gas, the price of everything else will increase 200 or even 300%.
Well, let's just take a look at how Egypt got to this point. It's been struggling to revive its economy since the 2011 protests that ended Hosni Mubarak's rule. The political unrest continued to destabilize the economy through 2013 when Mohamed Morsi was overthrown. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi promised to bring stability, but even after his election in 2014, security concerns scared away investors and foreign tourists. Egypt's tourism-dependent economy was hit badly when a Russian passenger plane was downed over the Sinai Peninsula last year, ISIL saying it caused that crash. And the World Bank says almost half of Egypt's young people are unemployed because of the crisis. Let's talk about all of this. Bring in our guest. Joining me from Cairo is Angus Blair. He's the president of the Signet Institute. From Berlin, Ahmed Badawi, a senior researcher at the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Politics at Free University. And Dalia Fahmy joining us from New York. She's a senior fellow at the Center for Global Policy. Welcome to all of you. Angus Blair, you are in Cairo, so I'll start with you first. It wasn't a surprise that this currency devaluation was announced, that it was going to happen, but can it do what the government wants it to do, and that is boost the economy?
Well, the market had been waiting a long time for this to happen. Frankly, the crisis has been decades in the making. It's not new. And what's happened is that in the last few months, as there have been delays in handling the currency crisis, the informal market has moved ahead and increased inflation. In addition to that, many domestic investors, many companies had stopped investing and stopped importing. And the end result was the economy was falling. And you saw that by the October, you call it the PMI survey, which had fallen to 42 versus 46 in September. And the end result was the economy was coming to a sort of not quite a standstill, because the economy is still growing relatively strongly.
So what you're saying is that in the long term, it will bring down the inflation rates?
Well, you have to remember, in all of the years I've covered Egypt, which is about 25 years, the inflation rate, the endemic inflation rate, has been higher than the global norm. There are very many internal inefficiencies in the internal market which lead it to have high inflation, which need to be looked at. And I hope that the government, in terms of its overall reform, look at this as well, because it isn't just imported inflation because of the devaluation of the pound. It's a number of reasons. But let me say this on the point of the devaluation. At a stroke, the government has gotten rid of a significant portion of doubt. There's no certainty in the marketplace, and companies can plan. They can plan for the future. It means there's a resetting of the economic equation to an extent in Egypt. It means that foreign investors can look at Egypt and think, okay, now there's the time to invest because something's happened. And it's a free float of the pound. And in terms of tourism, it's just the right time as capacity is beginning to get back on stream. It'll make Egypt a much more attractive destination and hopefully improve foreign exchange from tourism.
Ahmed, do you agree with that, and particularly the points that Angus makes on foreign direct investment? Will this encourage foreign investment to Egypt?
Yes, of course. Theoretically, it should encourage foreign direct investment. But Angus also made a very important point that the problems in Egypt go a lot deeper than a matter of devaluing the currency. There are structural problems in the economy, and they're mainly caused by bad economic management. And I think that in addition to devaluing the currency, there are a lot of other very important reforms that must be made by the government. They have to work much harder to boost exports. Egyptian exports have been declining, and of course now they need to use the opportunity of a weaker currency to boost exports. But then in order to boost exports, especially value-added exports, you need to have industry. And in order to have industry, the people in the country need to feel a sense of security. They need to start investing again. And I don't see how could this happen under the current political climate. The political and economic problems are very intimately linked. And looking only to do these economic structural reforms that are dictated to the Egyptian government by the IMF without thinking of the host of political reforms that must accompany these economic reforms will only repeat what happened during the last years of the reign of Mubarak. Remember, this is not the first time that Egypt devalues its currency. It happened before in 2003, and sure enough, all the indicators went up. There was more foreign direct investment, exports grew, but look what happened in 2011. Without serious political reforms to accompany the economic reforms, I'm afraid that this move will not provide the kind of benefits
we will
that are
be certainly
for.
talking about what kind of reforms are needed in Egypt's economy. But just adding to what you're saying, Ahmed, the central bank governor has said that these changes show political will does exist, that's according to him, to reform the economy, and that Egypt aimed to add $6 billion to its foreign reserves in the coming months. So like I said, we'll talk about the political will in a moment, but this $6 billion figure, is it optimistic?
So far, they say that they have managed to collect 60% of this figure. I don't think it's overly optimistic. I think it is doable. It is achievable, especially if the IMF gives the final approval for the $12 billion loan. That, I think, would open the gate and would increase confidence in the Egyptian economy. And I hope that, I think the problem is not really political will. It's a kind of an economic development philosophy, a certain doctrine, a certain statist-led doctrine that is adopted by the Egyptian government. And somehow they need to solve the contradiction between their desire for the state to push the economy forward and what is actually needed in order to let markets on their own work efficiently and to encourage investment and all that. This is a contradiction that the Egyptian government would really have to resolve very soon.
Dalia, I suppose the challenge here is to use the IMF funds wisely on behalf of the Egyptian government by investing them in projects that will actually yield proper economic reforms.
It's not just investing these funds wisely. The $12 billion are over 3 years. And the amount of debt that's held by the Egyptian economy is so large that it's not certain that this is going to offset in a way that's going to use this liberalization moment to be of benefit. This is supposed to be of benefit, and it favors exports, but not so much imports. And when the price of imports skyrockets, not just in food and petro, but also in hard machinery, the reforms promised in terms of economic restructuring to grow the industry are not necessarily going to happen. But even if we take a step back and look at the manner with which this has happened, we've been waiting for this for over a month. And then when it suddenly happens and it affects the stock index and the interest rate, and then the bank issues different numbers on the value of the Egyptian pound, it leads to a level of uncertainty, not just for the Egyptian population, but for foreign investment. And foreign investors are going to want to dollarize their guarantees because of the uncertainty of the Egyptian pound. And so when you have a level of uncertainty with the manner with which this has happened since yesterday, with the uncertainty of the value of the Egyptian pound, we're going to see investments in the dollarized form, and there's going to cause a run on the dollar, and we're going to see an increase in the black market rather than a decrease.
Well, speaking of the black market, that's what I wanted to ask you about, Dalia. The central bank governor is saying that this measure was designed to wipe out the advantage that the black market has had that has sucked the currency out of the banking system. So do you believe that this will not?
Had this been done in a manner that was actually leading to trust and stability and actually confidence in the currency, it would have led to a different result. But because it seems to be haphazard, tied to fundamental decrease in subsidies, we've seen the price of sugar go up 40%, the price of petrol go up between 35 and maybe even 65%, the price of food substances go up higher. This leads to a level of uncertainty that there will be a continued increase in the black market because the average Egyptian, as well as investors, are not going to have the trust in the value of the Egyptian pound.
Angus, speaking of the average Egyptian and the citizens, what matters to people on a day-to-day basis is how much they are paying for the basic goods and basic services. So are the people here the biggest losers?
The people in the streets, to an extent, are, but everyone really is affected in Egypt. I think that what the government has said, and actually the IMF, and you also please put this in context, this is not an IMF program. It's an Egyptian program which is being endorsed by the IMF and other parties like the EBRD and other global IFIs. It'll hurt, but what the government has done is create a stockpile of commodities to ensure that the average citizen through the smart card system is protected. There's been an increase in sugar, increase in fuel, but the smart card system, which is to protect the poor, which the government and the IMF have said is very important, will try to protect the poorest in society as much as possible. But there's an adjustment going, and it, frankly, as I said already, it's been decades in the making. There's been a population growth in Egypt 20 years ago was 1.2% per annum. It's now 2.5% per annum, an extra 2.5 million Egyptians on an annual basis. So, of course, the subsidy program was getting out of hand in terms of the costs. And the fiscal maneuverability for the government was getting to a stage where, frankly, it had no extra cash to be able to do very much at all. Something had to give. And what's happened is in the last few months, the planning has been put in place to allow for the devaluation, which I disagree with your last guest. Actually, the greater part of uncertainty has now been removed. What we've got is a few days of now creating the new system, which the banks had wanted for a free float. That will upset the black market, which is a darn good thing, because frankly, what was happening, because it was an artificial market to an extent, it wasn't just supply and demand, was that it was pushing costs up for everybody. But it had to happen. But it's only part of the overall program which needs to be looked at to make Egypt an attractive destination, first of all for domestic investors and then for foreign investors. But let me also mention that foreign direct investment into Egypt so far this year is as good as 2010. So things are not all bad. And let me also mention one extra very positive feature. Unlike other countries, including all of the West, government debt has risen from 70% of GDP, equivalent to around 100% of GDP, and that's painful. But private sector debt and household sector debt are well below global norms. They're a fraction, about less than 10% for household debt as a percent of GDP, and an enormous informal sector. That liquidity has kept the economy going and will ensure that if the government gets other things in line in the program over the next few weeks, will ensure the economy can recover from the currently between 3 and 4%, could reach 6% in about 2 years in terms of growth.
Okay, well, Angus, you rightly point out that this is an Egyptian program, and we must clarify that, and it is not an IMF program. However, the IMF had put certain requests on Egypt. So can I ask you from an economical point of view, is Egypt on track to deliver all the IMF requests, or are there more?
No, I think that's it in terms of what the IMF asked for, because you can't just give money to a country without having some conditionality.
Okay, Dalia in New York, Angus was disagreeing with what you had to say, that uncertainty has been removed. Would you like to weigh in on that?
So this current administration in Egypt has attempted to push a couple of things forward. In the eyes of the average Egyptian, if you saw the kind of silver bullet, the expansion of the Suez Canal was going to save us and save our economy, invest in this. If you look at the increasing role of the military in the economy, if you look at the fact that since 2011, 50% of the Egyptian population lives on less than $2 a day. If you look at that kind of uncertainty, the rise of the cost of household goods, the rise of food products, the rise of petrol exponentially, the taxes on things like cigarettes, these actually target directly or indirectly the poor. And so while there might be global certainty or trust in this kind of liberalization project in the long term, in the eyes of the average Egyptian, this is extremely uncertain, and this leads to further instability at this moment.
Ahmed, is there the patience in the population of Egypt, which is more than 90 million people, to see those types of increases over the short term at the same time when they say their wages haven't even gone up?
Well, no, of course, there's no patience, and people don't like to suffer economically. But I think in terms of timing, I think this happened at the right time politically, maybe not the right time economically, it's long overdue, but the right time politically in the sense that the government over the last year or year and a half or 2 years has been really cracking down on the opposition. Now, the people can maybe go out on a demonstration or become restive or whatever, but there is not an organized political force that can actually mobilize the people to create a real serious pressure on the regime. So in that sense, the people will have to suffer. I'm sorry to say that. And I don't think that they have the capacity to revolt or to engage in serious disobedience. And I think this is what the government is banking on. What the government is banking on now is to try to get the macroeconomy in order, to try to get the finances in order, and that will be coupled with political oppression, or maybe an increased dose of political oppression. And I think in the estimate of the government, I think they are looking for something like maybe 6 months to 1 year until the markets internalize the new economic reality and some kind of recovery starts. Once this happens, then I think the government would sigh in relief. If the next 6 months to 1 year, there is no serious political unrest, if they manage to crack down on the black market, it's also a political issue, not just an economic issue, then I think this move will be considered a good move. If it leads to more unrest, if it leads to the kind of uncertainty that Dalia was talking about, or if it scares foreign investors because of political instability, then I think that would be really bad, not just for the government, but for the country as a whole.
A short while ago, Ahmed, you brought up the point of structural reforms that Egypt needs, fundamental reforms to its economic system. What kind of reforms are you talking about here when the country, frankly, has been economically mismanaged for many years?
And this is precisely the dilemma that Egyptians are facing. They are being ruled by a regime that has shown over and over again, and I'm not only talking about the Sisi regime. The Sisi regime is an extension of the regime that has been ruling Egypt since 1952. It has shown over and over again its incapacity to produce sound policy. Now, in terms of reforms, first thing, of course, and it is really very important, to clamp down on corruption. Corruption is really endemic in Egypt, and it's not only because of its economic waste, but because of the social injustices that are created because of corruption. Second thing, and I think Dalia touched upon it, the role of the army in the economy. We have to be clear. Is this going to be a state-led development over the next period? And I doubt that this could work. We've seen that in the fiasco over this new Suez Canal and all these massive engineering projects. Or is this going to be a healthy economy, an environment that allow private entrepreneurs to thrive? If this is going to be the case, then the government and the army in particular, they have to find a way to slowly begin withdrawing from the economy and hand over economic management and the market to the private investors, whether domestic or not domestic.
Okay.
So basically, fighting corruption. Go ahead.
Angus, I'll come over to you in just a second, but first let me cross over to Dalia, because Dalia has been nodding along to what Ahmed had to say. And specifically when it comes to the military, when you have an institution like the Egyptian military that has been so entrenched in the Egyptian economy for decades, in fact, how difficult is it going to be?
You know, the fact that we actually don't know what percentage of the Egyptian economy is controlled by the military is very telling. You know, Professor Robert Springborn says it could be upwards of 40 to 60%, but we will never know. The fact that we don't know is extremely telling. But even if you move beyond that, if we're talking about the level of political repression that has to continue to happen for this to be a moment of economic success, then what is really Egypt's future? You know, it's the opening of Pandora's box of talking about the increased repression that will lead to political stability so that this economic project can be successful means that we're no longer talking about good governance, transparency, accountability, democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. These are really trying times. So we can't decouple the politics of all this. We can't decouple the role of the military in society. And we also have to understand that because of the level of crony capitalism, while this liberalization project should work on paper, until it's tied to fundamental political reform, Egypt will still continue to move on a path of maybe short-term success, but long-term repression.
Angus, when you speak to a lot of people in Egypt, I mean, and look at the statistics, unemployment standing at 12.8%. These are the latest figures I have. Correct me if I'm wrong. The youth bracket in that reaches 30%. I mean, those are a lot of the same reasons why there was an uprising to begin with. So is Egypt once again, in your opinion, you're sitting in Cairo, is it at risk of political instability once again because of the socio-economic conditions? That's one question. And then perhaps you can tell us whether there has been progress made in any areas economically.
Well, first of all, if you look globally, frankly, youth unemployment everywhere, particularly in Southern Europe, as well as the Middle East, North Africa, is high. And it is a global issue. Now, in this region, clearly, there's been uncertainty in some countries more than others. And because of the economy and the structures of the economy, there's a larger percentage of younger people who don't have jobs. You can see it from Morocco and Lebanon and Jordan and in the Gulf to an extent. It's a structural issue which has to be addressed by the overall investment climate, access to capital and education. And to create the new Egypt, you really have to make, I think, major investment in education, which at the moment Egypt doesn't have the finances for. So the answer is it's a longer term problem that has to be addressed on multiple levels in education, in access to capital, in creating the right conditions for even informal companies to set up. And as I mentioned already, the informal sector in Egypt is enormous, frankly, and it's one thing which has kept the economy going in the overall uncertainty for the last 5 years. As I mentioned, it is almost a Mediterranean issue. You have youth unemployment in Southern Europe of up to 60%. So in Egypt, that sense might be slightly better, but that's not an excuse. So basically, there's much more that needs to be done by everybody here. And I want to see more reform. I'm sorry?
Where has progress been made?
I think, first of all, we've seen a real commitment at last to making change. First of all, I think I mentioned already, foreign direct investment, even in the oil and gas sector the last few years, investment in the retail sector from one company alone, around $3 billion in the Emirates, investment into some agricultural projects, billions of dollars in investment in the electricity generation sector and capacity sector. So all of that is helping to stimulate investment for the future, but much more needs to be done. I think that one issue I should also say is that the work done by Dr. Farouk al-Akhtar, a previous central bank governor after 2004, the banking sector in Egypt went into this crisis in tremendously good shape, and we're low in debt. So the conditions to improve the economy are good. But that said, it is an uncertain period in terms of the livelihoods of people who are having to make major adjustments. It's not going to be easy. It is painful. And I think that all parties are looking for ways to help provide growth on the ground, whether it's through microfinance, micro-lending, and other help from the government and outside to be able to get people back to work as quickly as possible.
Okay.
But we won't really know that for a few months.
Okay, on that note, I'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Angus Blair, Ahmed Badawi, and Dalia Fahmy. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for watching. You can always see this program again anytime by visiting